Greetings, lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for the current installment of the Brothers' War story. In the previous part of the story, the brothers had just parted way at the grand meeting between multiple nations. And back at the camp of the warlord of Krug was in a massive rage. He was yelling at Urza, "Why didn't you tell me that your brother was among the Phylagi? And even more than that, why didn't you tell me that he is now the chief wizard amongst them?" Urza was rueful. "I didn't even know that he was alive. I'm as shocked as you are to find him here." This did nothing to mollify the warlord's anger. This dragon engine, what can it do? What are its powers? Urza looked down. "I have no idea." The warlord kept right at him. "Could you make one of these beasts?" Urza looked at him and said, "Probably, if I was given time to study it. Mishra did find it out in the desert, but it doesn't appear to be of Thran origin." The warlord looked puzzled. How did our patrols miss this? How would we miss something this large out in the desert? And Urza had a doubtful look on his face. I can't be certain that what Mishra is telling me here is actually 100% what happened, because we didn't really part on good terms. It's not 100% clear to me what's going on here. The warlord was seized with another fit of rage at this. "This has ruined all of our plans. The idea was to overawe these stupid desert dwellers, these worthless Phylagi, with our flight of ornithopters, leave them slack-jawed and in our power. Things cannot be left this way, because instead of us dominating them, now they have this massive dragon engine looming over this entire meeting, stating their power over us. It's very clear that Argive and Koilos want to head for the doors at this point. Something has to be done." The next day, all of the leaders met again at the main pavilion. The Phylagis started out by making a statement at the outset of the meeting that they intended to reclaim all of the lands that belonged to the Sawardi. And considering that the entirety of the lands of Krug basically at one point were Sawardi lands, this was a very big problem for the warlord. He started raging and yelling about how the Qadir is just some small child, and how they took the sword marches from the Sawardi, and those lands are theirs. At this point, the Qadir has his own rage to tap into. "Quiet, old man," is the first thing that comes out of his mouth when speaking to the warlord. "Don't speak that way to your betters. You may have scattered our people into the desert. My grandfather wandered the desert. My father gathered the people of the desert. And I return here triumphant and powerful at the head of my people to reclaim these lands. You call them the sword marches, but they are the Sawardi marches, and they will be ours once again." The warlord was livid. He stood up with a grim look on his face. "It's time to give you a demonstration in power, boy." And with that, he made a gesture off to one of the soldiers at the side of the pavilion. That soldier made a gesture off to some unseen people, and all of a sudden, there was the sound of multiple ornithopters launching into the air. The shock on Urza's face was plain. He turned to the warlord and said, "What's happening? What are you doing right now?" The warlord gave him a tight grin. "This is a lesson in power. You would do well to pay attention." As the warlord said that, the ornithopters started to reach their target. There were 11 ornithopters in total, and they were all flying over the Phylagi part of the meeting place. 5 of the ornithopters made a beeline towards the dragon engine, while the other 6 flew over the main encampment of the Phylagi. All of them started dropping massive casks of dwarven fire black. Explosions and screams and black greasy smoke filled the air. While the Phylagi themselves couldn't put up much of a defense, the dragon engine was a different story. It was no easy prey. The ornithopters were circling it and dropping casks of dwarven fire black down around the base of it. but it was having no real effect, unfortunately for the Ornithopter's pilots. The red mist that was blasting out of the dragon's engine mouth was very effective, catching one of the Ornithopters mid-air where it broke apart from the force of the blast. The cargo, the casks of Dwarven Fireblack, igniting and blasting the Ornithopter to bits right up there in the sky for everyone to see. Back at the meeting place, the Argivians were hiding under the table, trembling in fear. The mercenaries that were in the pay of Koilos were dragging out the Koilos leader forcibly as she was trying to stay and start to fight. The mercenaries knew there was no way they were going to get paid if she got taken down here, so they weren't having it. Now back with the warlord and the Kadir, the warlord headed towards the Kadir, but the Kadir, despite the fact that he was quite chubby, was still younger and faster than the warlord. So he ends up ramming his scimitar straight through the warlord's body, just ending him in one single blow. And Urza screams out, "No!" as his father-in-law's life is ended. And then he points over to his giant mechanical man. "Stop him!" pointing at the Kadir, and the mechanical man tromps over with his unsteady gait, and he grabs onto the Kadir by the throat and lifts him up in the air, just choking him. And at this point, that's when Mishra and Ashnod enter into it. Ashnod leveled her staff at the metal man and released the magic within. Urza felt waves of nausea hit him, and the metal man slowed, but the power of the staff was not enough to overcome the automaton. So Mishra had to step forward, and using the power of his weak stone, he was able to diminish the strength of the metal man to the point where they were able to pry his fingers free of the Kadir's neck, and he dropped to the ground gasping for breath. At this point, Mishra brings in his dragon engine and it smashes into the pavilion. Ashnod stops using her magical staff and turns and drags the Kadir away like a limp doll. She's very annoyed at having to do this duty. Urza turns to his metal man and starts to reinforce it with magic from the Might Stone. And at the same time, he's calling out to Mishra, "Brother, we must end this." But Mishra isn't having it. He's livid. He snarls back at his brother. "More betrayal!" And Urza tries to explain further, but at that point, all the power that was cascading through the metal man from both of the brothers' stone erupt in a massive explosion, and the metal man bursts apart in a fiery blast. Mishra takes the opportunity to run off, while Urza stays with the body of his father-in-law, the now deceased warlord, as the captain of the troops reports to him. Urza learned that they had lost 4 of the 11 ornithopters in that maneuver. Then the Koilos mercenaries had helped and were expecting payment as a result. The Argivians, expectedly, had bolted at the first moment and were long gone. This was the moment when Urza realized that he was in command. With the warlord gone, everything rested on his shoulders. So he started to demand answers from the captain of the troops. Why did this happen? This was premeditated. This use of Dwarven Fireblack was intentional. And the captain of the guard started to get kind of shifting on his feet. He didn't really want to answer because at this point, the captain of the guard isn't really sure how to handle this, because up until this point, he was a servant of the warlord, and now he's in direct service to Urza, who is clearly quite angry with the way that things went. Urza made the preparations and personally flew the warlord's body back home in 2 days, half the time it took for the original trip out there. The warlord's death rocked Yosha to its core. He had been integral to the national identity. The warlord had ruled for so long that most people in Yosha couldn't even picture a world without him. He was a permanent fixture, and rumors raged about what had happened. The warlord had been cut down by a Phylagi. No, his heart had been burst by foul Phylagi magics. Instead, others said he had been boiled alive by a demonic machine controlled by Urza's mad brother. Some people even said that an amulet that had been created by the chief artificer and given to the warlord had exploded. Even others said that the warlord died saving Urza from a red-haired demon. The funeral lasted for 10 days. People came from the furthest reaches of Yosha. Guards were mounted all around the body of the warlord, not to protect him, but to move people who had fainted along so that other people could come and pay their respects. On the last day of the funeral ceremonies, Urza and Kayla appeared, both looking grim and haggard. It didn't take long for life to return to a semblance of normalcy. However, underneath the surface, rage boiled. The Phylagi would pay for the warlord's death. Phylagi traders were mobbed in the streets. Young adventurers would head out from Yosha and raid into Phylagi lands, and none of them would return, which would spur even more to head in looking to find them, who also would not return. It got so bad that the Yoshan military opened its arms wide for enlistment, and the number of people who were joining the army tripled in a month. Urza disappeared into his laboratory, and over the next month, all pilots that had gone on the Corlinda trip were reassigned to the front lines facing off against the desert-dwelling Phylagi. Of Rusko, there was no sign. He was alive, but definitely no longer in Krug. The Phylagi, for their part, stayed mostly quiet. There were some brief raids back and forth, but Kayla and Urza made a royal decree that they would hold Yosha, but they would not go into Phylagi territory. The people took this as a sign that Urza had big plans. Urza had constantly been at work, only stopping to eat, sleep, or send and respond to quick messages. Tanos was one of the very few who could get time with Urza, and one night he asked, "Why are we not striking back against the Phylagi? Why do you do nothing?" Urza's angry response surprised Tanos. "It's an absolute waste. We've already lost 4 ornithopters and lives. You want me to waste more gold and lives chasing ghosts in the desert? Well, I won't do it. I may as well just burn Krug down myself if that was the case." Tanos let the matter drop, and they continued work as usual. Messages came, and Urza would ignore most of them. The ones with the Queen's signet mark, he never opened those. They piled up one after another off by the doorway. Eventually, one showed up addressed to Tanos instead of Urza, and in it, there was a secret decree that Tanos was to come and meet with Kayla. When he came at her summons, he found that she had been in the wine. On top of that, she was very scantily dressed under the robe that she was wearing, and she appeared to be flaunting it. Now, Tanos was a very naive village boy, but the signs of what was going on here was very obvious to him, and he was immediately nervous. It had reached the point where Kayla needed somebody to talk to. And she explained this to Tanos, and Tanos just came back with, "Have you actually spent the time to talk with Urza? He watched your father die, and he could do nothing. He could do nothing to save your father, and now he has to come back to you as a failure?" This basically made everything click together for Kayla, because up until that point, she was feeling like she had been shunted off to the side wrongly, and she realized what was really going on was that Urza was actually punishing himself. He felt that he had failed and didn't deserve to return to her, but she wasn't sure what she should do. So she asked Tanos, "Should I be direct with him?" Tanos shook his head. "I don't think that would work in this case. Maybe if you had some kind of nice memory that you shared?" A big smile split Kayla's face. "I have the perfect thing. Take this letter to Urza for me," as she quickly jotted down a note. "Make sure that he reads it." 15 minutes later, Urza poked his head hesitantly through the door. "Wife, I heard that you have a technical emergency that you need fixed?" Kayla looked at Urza. "Yes, husband. I have this silver music box. It no longer plays." Urza walked over curiously. "It's probably just wound down again." Kayla was wide-eyed and she said with mock sincerity, "Wound down?" Urza looked at her. "Yes, I would need a key." Kayla was ready for this. "Will this do?" As she said it, she dropped the robe she was wearing. and the old battered rusty key from Rusko's shop was hanging there around her neck. A grateful and relieved smile spread across Urza's face. It will indeed. Urza didn't head back to work for the next 3 days, but he did leave detailed notes for Tawnos to bring all the students back, as well as planned ornithopter upgrades and a new automaton design that he called Urza's Avenger. Now over on Mishra's side of things, his retreat from Corlinda was very different. Mishra did what he could to protect the Phylagi using his dragon engine, but ultimately they were forced to flee in the night, hiding by day, always looking for hiding spots for the dragon engine along the way. The ornithopters giving chase and making things very difficult for them. By the time they made it back to Phylagi lands, they had lost 80% of the men they brought with them. The Kadir was very angry about this. He blamed Mishra. "You should have known that your brother planned to betray us. You should have focused on protecting me instead of commanding that engine around." Underneath it all, the Kadir was also angry because Mishra was becoming more popular with the Phylagi. He was given credit for saving the survivors by use of his dragon engine, but nobody was talking about the Kadir. The Kadir raged about the advantage that his enemies had. "They have those ornithopters, and all we have is one dragon engine. You should have found more by now." Mishra knew he needed to do something to calm the Kadir down, so he sent scouts out into the desert with instructions detailing how they could find Thran burial sites. And they came back with the discovery. They had found a great Thran wagon out in the desert. So Mishra and Ashnod headed out to take a look at it. Unfortunately, when Mishra arrived, he realized that this would not suit his needs. It was indeed a gigantic Thran wagon, but it was very rusty, it had shattered wheels, and he could see how it would go back together and ultimately knew that it would not be impressive enough to make an impact with the Kadir. So telling no one, Ashnod and Mishra headed off together to return to the cave of Koilos and see if they could find something of use. The dragon engine could naturally feel the way back to the caves, but due to the nature of the magical link between Mishra and the dragon engine was able to naturally sense where Mishra wanted it to go and was heading to the caves of Koilos. This proved to be very handy when a grandfather storm descended on them out of the desert. A grandfather storm is pure black dust with massive tornadoes that swirl around the edges of it and is basically unsurvivable. The only reason that Ashnod and Mishra were able to make it through was because there was a small compartment inside the dragon engine that was filled with supplies and had just enough room for 2 people to fit inside of very uncomfortably. Now the sound outside was just the storm raging. So to distract themselves, they started by talking about stories and things like that, but because they were stuck in there for a full 10 days, by the end of it, Mishra was instructing Ashnod in Phylagi etiquette, and because Ashnod was so rough around the edges, she was getting very frustrated with all of the criticism that was being leveled her way. Now fortunately for them, the storm did subside after those 10 days. They were able to get out of the dragon engine and see that everything around the desert had been scoured of all life. There was no sign of life anywhere, and even the landmarks, the rock formations, had been submerged under sands, and now you had new ones sticking up out in different locations. So it completely transformed the landscape of the area they were in. They traveled for another full week to reach the area where the caves were, and this area was untouched by the storm, so it looked very much the way it had when Mishra was originally there. When they arrived at the cave, the first thing they did was search around outside. They actually wasted a couple of days this way, sifting through all of the wreckage that was left over, but ultimately, after what had happened the previous time they were there was nothing they could salvage. And that led to the realization that they would have to actually go into the cavern itself. And when they settled down that night to sleep, Mishra had nightmares. He woke up screaming. He kept talking about a dark wind that wanted to whisper secrets to him. The next day they headed in. It was Ashnod's first time seeing the place, so she was more full of wonder. Mishra was determined and somewhat uninterested until they ran into the remains of the Suchis that had chased him and Urza previously. At that point, he picked up one of the Suchi skulls and he threw it against the wall. It cracked open and a power stone fell out that still had a glow of power. Mishra scooped that power stone up and him and Ashnod wandered further down in towards the main room where they had originally found the power stone together. So they arrive at that room with all the Thran machinery, and Mishra walks in and places the Suchi's power stone into the center console. And when this happens, all of a sudden there's this humming all around them, and a soft light fills the room. And Ashnod turns to him and said, "How did you know to do that?" And Mishra said, "I just knew," with a shrug. Ashnod turned and stared at the glyphs that had lit up. Somewhere among them was a way to open a door to another place, to the realm of mechanical wonders where the dragon engine came from. The plan was to go there and acquire more exotic mechanical wonders for the Kadir. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mishra asked, "Well?" Ashnod turned to him. "I'm not sure exactly what we're dealing with here. All of these symbols could be anything. They could be labels, they could be warnings. I have no idea." She did hazard a guess. This one in particular might be the one. Mishra looked over her shoulder and nodded. "Do it." She looked him in the eyes. "Do you know this for sure?" He shook his head. "No, I'm guessing, but it feels right." Ashnod reached out and lightly touched the glyph. When she did, a chime resonated through the building, and a tiny little bit of light cut the air. It started to stretch out into a glowing disc floating mid-air, radiant, and it kept stretching until it was twice the size of Mishra. Ashnod was awestruck. She took her staff and walked up to it and pushed the staff in through the disc and noticed that on the other side of it, she couldn't see her staff coming through. And when she pulled the staff back out, it seemed unharmed. So Mishra, looking at the portal, decided, "This is our door. We found our way in." Ashnod went in first. Dangerous and unpleasant jobs go to the apprentice. As she stepped through the portal, she immediately felt this wet heat slicken her skin, and she could smell in the air dwarven fire black and fire as well. There were strange metal plants all around her, vibrant, but their colors were all wrong, and the vines that snaked in between them were very much uniform, like cables. She reached out and touched a flower, but immediately pulled her hand back as the flower stung her. A tiny metallic dragonfly landed on the flower, and she reached her hand towards it, but it darted off deep into the forest. She turned around, and Mishra had stepped through the portal. He looked all around him and said, "I remember this place." Ashnod gave him a look. "You've been here before?" Mishra said, "In a dream only, never in the flesh." Ashnod noticed something seemed to be off with Mishra, like he was in a small trance, but she didn't have any longer to think about it, as he looked all about him and proclaimed loudly, "Phyrexia!" And that ends the lore for this installment of the Brothers War story. I hope that you've enjoyed it. If you appreciate our work and want to support it, you can join our Patreon or the channel membership. Thanks for coming by, my friends. And remember, lore is life.